All right, folks, here we are again. I have no idea what week this is, but we're talking about evaluating sources today. We've talked about this before, but we're going to do it in some depth. Last week, we looked at and used the Deconstructing News workbook, and there are 7 steps in the deconstruction of news, and one of them, probably the most important, is the evaluation of sources. And so we're going to go into some depth about that this time around. And Margaret Sullivan, the media columnist for the Washington Post, and the former ombudsperson for the New York Times, what they called the public editor, it was called at the New York Times. She says it really comes down to something as wonkish sounding as news literacy. People have to bring a kind of critical thinking to what they're seeing, and that's a lot to ask of the ordinary news consumer. But I do think it has to happen. You have to look at a source and say, is this a trustworthy source? And compare and contrast. And again, and I'm going to emphasize this today, the word source. We use it carelessly. These are outlets. These are all news outlets. Okay? An outlet is a purveyor of news, a transmitter of news. A source is an individual person or document or sets of documents or bits of evidence which we use to bring information to an outlet. These, on the other hand, are sources. Former CDC, Center for Disease and Control Director Tom Frieden, we have to rethink how we address infection control. He's doing a press briefing. Okay, he's a source of information. Family matriarch Mama June Shannon said, the statement of me dating a sex offender is totally untrue. There's a story about this person. They interview her, they quote her. She is a source. Officer Kenneth Healy and 3 on-duty colleagues were posing for a picture when a hatchet-wielding man charged at them unprovoked, according to New York Police Commissioner Bill Bratton. Bill Bratton, in this case, was a source. A student locked down inside a classroom told CNN by phone that the shooting began in the cafeteria. Okay, as an onlooker, it's an unnamed source, but we have to trust the journalists for not creating sources, but actually using sources even when they can't be named. Sources are important for a lot of reasons. After 9/11, and then in the months leading up to the March 2003 invasion of Iraq by U.S. forces, the New York Times had scoop after scoop by reporter Judith Miller, whose long work in the region and her connections no one else had. The picture she painted was that Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons and was ready to use them. Now, the stereotypical view of the New York Times is that it is a keystone of the so-called liberal media and a Democratic House organ. This is pure nonsense. And I think the record of the New York Times during the build-up to our invasion of Iraq is evidence that it's nonsense. No one in a leadership position at the Times, not editor-in-chief Bill Keller, not publisher Arthur Ochs Sulzberger, as much as blinked an eye as she delivered on a nearly daily basis a year's worth of messages coming straight out of the Bush White House. All skepticism was left at the door. And here's a source that we 2003, U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell addressed the United Nations Security Council with evidence, he said, that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and that the invasion of Iraq would be the only way to stop Hussein from using them on the U.S. or other enemies. However, 4 days earlier, Powell met with intelligence officials to hash out the details of his address. Powell is reported to have thrown the draft in the air and exclaimed, "I'm not reading this. This is bullshit." But he did read it, and by March 5th, the Times and CBS News reported that their joint polling showed 55% of Americans supported an invasion of Iraq. I think it's important to point out that this information from February 1st, 2003, was not reported as much, if at all, as the reporting of his February 5th, 2003 address to the UN Security Council. This, "I'm not reading this, this is bullshit," came out before the invasion, but it wasn't really reported on until after the invasion. And of course, this was a serious deal. We invaded Iraq to capture weapons of mass destruction that it ended up didn't exist. More than 500,000 Iraqis died in the conflict that began with the shock and awe bombings on March 19th, 2003. During the active phase of our combat there, more than 4,400 U.S. soldiers were killed and 31,827 were wounded in action. Say nothing of the number of service members who came home with serious problems like post-traumatic stress disorder. And of course, no weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq. What were we doing in Iraq? People began to ask, and how did the Times get it so wrong? On May 26, 2004, the New York Times published a lengthy description of what the paper got wrong and how that happened. It boiled down to sources, as New York Magazine pointed out, anonymous sources whose personal interests, it turns out, made them poor partners in a disinterested search for the truth. And here's what the editors said in the New York Times. The problematic articles varied in authorship and subject matter, but many shared a common feature. They depended, at least in part, on information from a circle of Iraqi informants, defectors, and exiles bent on regime change in Iraq. People whose credibility has come under increasing public debate in recent weeks. There were people in our government and elsewhere who had set out to hoodwink the press. But a careful news consumer armed with the ability to evaluate sources for themselves might not have trusted the New York Times reporting because so much of it was based on unnamed sources providing unverified, uncorroborated material. And so the New York Times and the media in general pointed the blame away from themselves, from their reporting, and towards bad sources. This was their mistake. They chose bad sources, and that's fine. They say confession is good for the soul. But this apology leaves out a number of equally serious errors and omissions that might have slowed or stopped the U.S. march to invasion. For instance, former U.S. Marine Corps intelligence officer and UN weapons inspector in Iraq, Scott Ritter, objected publicly that WMDs had been destroyed following the first Gulf War in 1991. Ritter had been on the ground in Iraq between 1991 and 1998 as part of the UN inspections team that was supervising the destruction of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. So he was a pretty good source. And he says that the CIA knew since 1992 that significant aspects of the Iraqi weapons programs had been completely eliminated. and said, furthermore, in October of 1992, I personally confronted the CIA on the reality that we had accounted for all of Iraq's ballistic missile programs. They had an Iraqi defector who had laid out the totality of the Iraqi biological weapons program and had acknowledged that all of the weapons had been destroyed. The CIA knew this. And then there are other sources. On March 7th, 2003, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the Director General, Mohammed El-Baradei, and the Executive Chairman of the UN's Special Commission on Iraq, Hans Blix, told the United Nations Security Council that there was no evidence or plausible indication of the revival of a nuclear weapons program in Iraq. The failures of U.S. journalism were caused not just by dependence on Bush administration sources who lied, but by the failure of the American press to report on information that had been in the public record and were well reported in the press overseas. For instance, the historical and ideological impossibility of any kind of an alliance between al-Qaeda and Iraq. The forgery of evidence that Saddam Hussein purchased yellowcake uranium from Niger, the so-called Downing Street memos that showed collusion between the United States and the United Kingdom in planning what was essentially an illegal invasion, and the testimony of intelligence professionals that some in the Bush administration had been pushing for and planning an invasion of Iraq since the 1990s, before Bush was even elected. One of the reasons that you're in this class, and one of the reasons why Roosevelt University is doing this class, is because we are serious about the idea of teaching and helping you to think critically. The phrase gets slung around a lot, so as we plunge into this part of the course, let's remind ourselves what that means. The American educator, scholar, and psychologist John Dewey coined the phrase critical thinking. Here's what he meant. Critical thinking is an active process by which you methodically test a statement or argument. One way is by evaluating the question, who says? One of the most important questions that human beings can ask. Who says? Common sense source evaluation. We've heard this phrase before. We've used it a few times, but we're going to talk about it for the next few minutes. And my notes say, which were written for the classroom, don't write these down. Well, you don't have to. You've got them on your workbook. You've got them in these PowerPoint presentations. So listen, who is this source? Okay? How would this person know about this? Is anyone else telling the same story? These are all just common sense questions. Is this person providing evidence or just making assertions? There's a big difference between that. Does this source have a dog in the fight? In other words, does this source have some sort of interest that would be served or disserved by a particular piece of information becoming public? Okay. So let's look at an example. Can cell phones crash airlines?
We can all confess the truth tonight. A lot of us barely pay attention to those announcements at the start of an airplane flight. The ones ordering passengers to turn off electronic devices, cell phones, Blackberries, iPods. They tend to seem routine by now, an excess of caution. But tonight, an exclusive from our chief investigative correspondent, Brian Ross, who obtained confidential testing and evidence in the ways some planes are very vulnerable to those devices. And he is with us now. Brian.
Good evening, Diane. This new report describes what could be some very scary scenarios, especially at lower altitudes on older aircraft involving just one cell phone.
Please turn off and stow all portable electronic devices.
Passengers have long been skeptical that their cell phones could actually lead to a problem on a huge airliner.
Do I obey? No.
But now a confidential industry study obtained by ABC News reveals some 75 instances over the last 6 years in which airline pilots and engineers connected cell phones to serious safety issues. One example, on a 747 at 4,500 feet when the autopilot disengaged by itself. Flight attendants were sent through the cabin and discovered 4 passengers still using their electronic devices. After passengers were told to turn them off, aircraft proceeded without further incident.
There's wireless devices installed in here and equipment up overhead.
Dave Carson of Boeing says even the emissions from just one cell phone can throw off sensitive electronic sensors located throughout the passenger cabin.
Is it that powerful?
It is when it goes in the right place at the right time.
Boeing engineers are especially concerned about planes landing in low visibility conditions and losing their instrument landing system or getting false readings on them.
It could tell you that you were to the right of the runway when in fact you were left of the runway, or just completely wipe out the signal so that you didn't get any indication of where you are coming in.
At Boeing's electronic testing lab in Seattle, engineers showed ABC News how certain devices send off signals greater than what Boeing says is an acceptable limit, indicated by the green line. A BlackBerry, an iPhone, even an iPad, whose clock circuitry emitted several spikes over the limit. At airports today, some passengers were paying much closer attention following the ABC News report.
I think, what's one cell phone going to do, really? But after seeing the report, it's given me some pause, so the phone goes off from here on.
Newer aircraft are now being designed to be better shielded from BlackBerry and iPhone and cell phone interference. But aviation experts say there will still be many on the ground, in the air, that are not shielded, and it'll be years before any change in the rules can even be considered, Diane.
All right, new reason to pay attention to that warning. Thank you, Brian.
Okay, you've seen this before. We're familiar with this, and in this course, this is the tool that we use to methodically evaluate sources who showed up in news stories. Are they independent, impartial, multiple sources corroborated by evidence, or are they lone sources? Is the information they're giving verifiable? Is there evidence to back it up, or is it merely an assertion with no immediately obvious evidence to support it? Is the person authoritative and informed, or are they uninformed? And finally, are they named or are they unnamed? Okay, so first question, independent. Does this source have anything to gain by withholding information or making misleading statements? If there is a conflict, the most reliable source has no stake in the outcome. Independent experts, for example, are less likely to mislead us than partisans. Okay, so a source who doesn't have a stake in the outcome, who is therefore independent, is usually reliable. In the case of the video that we just watched, Dave Carson, who is an associate technical engineer for Boeing, he would appear to be not self-interested. But when you think about it, he is not going to lie about something like this, because Boeing would have at least civil and possibly criminal liability in the case of an air crash where there was fatalities involved. Okay. Are there multiple sources? Are claims or assertions made by some corroborated by facts or by the assertions of other sources? Information coming from several sources is usually more reliable than something just one person is saying. In scientific circles, we say data is stronger if multiple researchers conducting the same experiment replicated the findings. It's more than just strength in numbers, which is a logical fallacy, by the way. If several people independent of one another are saying the same thing, you can trust it more. Okay, so we're now up to the V. What's the difference between verify and assert? Well, you've had time to think about that. An assertion is essentially just a statement. You're saying that there is a state of being that exists, and you're hoping that somebody believes you. But you could be making things up too. So statements, assertions, claims should be verifiable. There should be evidence to back them up. Sources who back up what they say with facts are more valuable than ones who make unverifiable accusations or offer opinions, inferences, or hunches without corroboration. Okay, is the source of your information authoritative and informed or knowledgeable? Sources who know what they're talking about are always more valuable than sources who don't have the credentials or information to speak knowledgeably about a subject. And are they named? Sources who are fully identified and speak on the record are accountable for what they say. The chief problem with anonymous sources is how little readers have to go on as they try to assess reliability. Anonymous sources should be used rarely, and they should be used for good and compelling reasons. This is why we value whistleblowers, but we shouldn't just believe whistleblowers on their word. A whistleblower who can make a claim, but then also point us in the direction of evidence that supports that claim, are very valuable. Here are some questions to ask yourself when you're evaluating an anonymous source. Is there an adequate explanation why the source must remain anonymous? Fear of retribution, for instance, or fear of prosecution. That is what we call transparency. Is there sufficient information given to establish the source's value? A witness, a co-worker. That's characterization. Is there other information in the story from named sources, documents, or other forms of evidence that independently corroborate what the anonymous source says? That's corroboration. If you don't have all that, you probably ought to look twice before using this anonymous source. Probably the most famous history was the person that we have come to know as Deep Throat. It's pretty tempting to dismiss all anonymous sources as untrustworthy, especially when we go back and consider the quality of the journalism that led up to our invasion of Iraq and the whole weapons of mass destruction question. But when corroborated with other kinds of evidence, unnamed sources, usually insiders, can be the only way news consumers learn about serious problems in government or elsewhere. An anonymous source was one key to the Washington Post investigation of the attempted cover-up of the role Nixon's White House and campaign played in a break-in at the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate Hotel. Deep Throat was first introduced to the public in the book written by Washington Post reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein about how they broke the Watergate story. His identity was the best kept secret in Washington until June 2005, when his imminent death prompted him to go public. He was Mark Felt, the second in command at the FBI, and he fed Woodward and Bernstein a series of tips the FBI had been forced to sit on by the Nixon White House. The scandal would eventually lead to the resignation of President Nixon as well as prison terms for 6 White House staffers and presidential advisors. Felt was the key to the Washington Post's Watergate investigation. Without his information, the puny Washington, D.C. newspaper would not have been able to take on the executive branch of the United States government. And if you're interested in learning more about him, there's a movie from just a few years ago with Liam Neeson and Diane Lane, Mark Felt, the man who brought down the White House. This is not a commercial. I'm not advertising it, but I think you find it on either on Netflix, in which case it's free, or Amazon, in which case there might be a nominal rental fee of $2 or $3. I've seen it. It's a good story. Not an advertisement. Okay. Bret Baier, Fox News anchor, in a rare on-air apology, told Fox viewers there was no proof to back up a single anonymous source's belief that Hillary Clinton's private server had been hacked by 5 foreign intelligence agencies. He also told viewers that he misspoke when he said Clinton would likely be indicted after the election based on what his anonymous FBI sources were saying. We have no way of knowing what his anonymous source said or really knew. What you know is that he relied on one anonymous source for the hacking information, and that his report on the likelihood of a criminal indictment against Hillary Clinton could only be speculation, an assertion that couldn't possibly be verified. As Baier noted in his apology, only a prosecutor and a grand jury could produce an indictment.
I was quoting from one source about his certainty that the server had been hacked by 5 foreign intelligence agencies, and while others believe that is probable because of the confirmed hacking of email accounts Secretary Clinton communicated with, as of today, there are still no digital fingerprints of a breach, no matter what the working assumption is within the Bureau. All the time, but especially in the heated election, on a topic this explosive, every word matters, no matter how well sourced. Which brings me to this. I explained a couple of times yesterday the phrasing of one of my answers to Brit Hume on Wednesday night, saying it was inartful. The way I answered the last question about whether the investigations would continue after the election. And I answered that, yes, our sources said it would. They would continue to likely an indictment. Well, that just wasn't inartful. It was a mistake. And for that, I'm sorry. I should have said they will continue to build their case. Indictment obviously is a very loaded word, John, especially in this atmosphere, and no one knows if there would or would not be an indictment, no matter how strong investigators feel their evidence is. It's obviously a prosecutor who has to agree to take the case and make that case to a grand jury. We stand by the sourcing on the ongoing, active Clinton Foundation investigation and are working to get sources with knowledge of the details on the record and on camera, hopefully today.
And who are all of these talking heads on cable news shows? These are all sources of information. Some are journalists, like this particular panel. Some are commentators who are paid to be impartial analysts. Some are spokespeople or experts who are not paid but are readily identified. And some are contributors who are completely biased but still are paid, though they are really little more than corporate spokespersons. And then the matter gets more confused when a cable news program mixes all of them together and makes them seem like equally reliable sources. The reason I have contributors is that in theory they should be very authoritative, though totally self-interested. But in most cases they reveal very little, and the programs are not transparent about who they present. Independence, multiplicity, verifiability, authoritativeness, and named, not anonymous sources. That's our system for evaluating the reliability of sources. Now let's watch the next story and think about corroboration.
Those safety concerns about guardrails on the nation's roads. A new lawsuit says a common type of guardrail can potentially cause serious injury or even death in some accidents. ABC's Brian Ross is back, has that story for us.
Well, good morning again, Robin. This is a story about twisted metal, lost limbs, and painful death. An ABC News investigation into a fixture of American highways that is now at the center of a huge controversy, producing outrage from motorists across the country. Just after midnight on Interstate 40 in North Carolina, where a guardrail meant to protect almost killed.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
The motorist hit the guardrail head-on after nodding off, and the long steel rail, seen in this photo from behind the driver and passenger seats, sliced through the SUV and then cut off his legs.
I lost my legs in a wreck. Are you saying you've lost both your legs, sir? Yeah.
In another case, 31-year-old Rebecca Dreyer, a single mom from Pennsylvania, lost her right leg after hitting a guardrail during a rainstorm.
I didn't realize that it essentially was a spear that came through my car.
Now she and others are suing the company that makes them, Trinity Industries of Texas, saying there's something wrong with hundreds of thousands of their guardrails across the country.
My sneaking suspicion is that this is really just the tip of the iceberg.
As seen in this test video, thanks to an ingenious design of what's called the end terminal, guardrails are supposed to be able to absorb a direct hit, even at 62 miles an hour, without turning into deadly spears. But according to the people suing Trinity, including this competitor, Josh Harmon, the company slightly changed by just an inch some of the dimensions of the end terminals, disrupting the basic physics of the device.
This failed. This is a classic failure.
These devices are designed, supposed to save your life, and they're not.
In fact, the inventor of the original guardrail terminal, Dr. Dean Sicking, a leading expert on impact, now studying football injuries, tells ABC News the changes made by Trinity were done without his knowledge.
I was not involved in that change and never really understood why they did it.
According to internal company documents obtained by ABC News, Trinity engineers calculated shaving off an inch would save about $2 for each ET, end terminal. That's $50,000 a year and $250,000 in 5 years by using the 4-inch channel, the memo reads. Trinity says its modified guardrail terminals have passed crash tests like this one and met all federal standards. But now many question whether the crash tests in ideal conditions reflect what happens in the real world. Rebecca Dreyer says she knows too well what happens in the real world and says it's now time for the Trinity guardrails to be taken off the highways.
Because how many more people do you want to lose limbs and go through all of this?
But for now, those guardrail terminals remain on the road all across the country. But federal highway officials tell ABC News today a nationwide review of the safety and performance of all guardrails is now being planned.
Well, we see those all the time. We never stop to think.
Exactly
all
right.
Brian.
Hidden hazard.
So how would you evaluate these sources? Victim, Rebecca Dreyer. Lawyer, David Quass, suggesting that this is just the tip of the iceberg. Josh Harmon, the identified whistleblower from a rival guardrail company, shows the evidence of the impact from the specifications change. Dean Sicking, the safety engineer who designed the original guardrail and questioned why his specifications were changed. Trinity Industries, the guardrail manufacturer, being investigated and sued for alleged faulty guardrails. Their company head, who was named, Greg Mitchell, declined to comment for this news story, but the company defended its product in a statement and supported it with crash test results. All of them are named, except for the source of the company documents obtained by CBS. But not one of these sources is wholly independent. Each has some degree of self-interest. But some back up their statements, and some are able to speak with authority on the issue. The company is the only source defending the safety of its guardrails, and of course they would be doing that. The other sources have the strength of being part of a multiplicity of sources that are making the same point. You may not like the lawyer, David Quass, and you may question his intentions. He certainly has a strong economic self-interest in this case. Rebecca Dreyer, the victim, she has an economic self-interest in this case as well, but she's also missing a leg. So it's not a capricious self-interest. The whistleblower, he might be legitimately, genuinely upset about this change in the specifications, but he does work for a rival company, and that shouldn't be enough to make you feel like you have to dismiss his testimony. The safety engineer, who is very independent, he invented this thing, and so he has a self-interest in seeing that it's used correctly. And then, of course, the guardrail manufacturer themselves. Evaluate sources, evaluate sources, evaluate sources. See how they, it's never going to be, you're never going to, or rarely, it will be rare that you've got a source that satisfies all of these criteria. I am vain, right? But do they satisfy enough of the criteria to make you feel confident in believing their assertions? Okay, so you should be getting going through your deconstruction workbook, and we walked through it in our presentation last class, or last presentation, using critical thinking to analyze the components of a news story, to dispassionately judge its reliability. And let's one more time talk about the 7 steps. We're summarizing the main points of the story. We're comparing the headline to the story to see if there hasn't been some hype inserted, or if there's any reason that we should question further the truthfulness of the story. We're assessing the evidence supporting the main points of the story. What kind of evidence is it? Is it direct or indirect? We're evaluating the sources, and that's what we've been talking about today, using I am vain. Does the reporter make his or her work transparent? How do you know what the reporter knows? Does the reporter know everything? Is the reporter telling you how he or she knows what she knows? Is the reporter telling you what she doesn't know, or he doesn't know, and why? These are all marks of transparency. Does the reporter place the facts, the story, in context? Are the key questions answered? Who, what, when, where, why, and how? And finally, is the story balanced? Is it fair? Is balance called for? Summarize for yourself the main points. This will get you, as we've said a few times now, out of the automatic reading mode and into a critical thinking mode. Question, question, question. A well-made, reliable story will have a headline and lead that match the facts. Evaluate the evidence. Is it indirect or direct? Did the reporter, once again, open the freezer? Evaluate the sources, not the news outlets, but the sources they use to bring you this story. Are they reliable? Use I am vain to make this determination. Does the reporter make his or her work transparent? I've used the metaphor of scientific method several times this semester, and one of the steps in scientific method is publication of research findings with all of your detailed data, methodology, etc., and then encouraging other scientists to review it. If someone else can verify your story, if you provide them the information that they need to go and find the facts for themselves, then your work is transparent. Does the reporter place the facts, the story, in context? Are the key questions answered? And is the story fair? The question of fairness and balance is one that we've talked about in class before, and it's a complicated question. But you should know that balance is called for when the truth of a situation is not yet known, or where there's a real lack of consensus about what happened. When things are uncertain, then it's fair. It's a sign of balance to show as many sides of opposing points of view as possible. Fairness is a little different. Fair when the evidence is overwhelming, regardless of those who wish it were not so. Climate change, for instance. Is the preponderance of evidence that climate change is real and is a result of human activity on the Earth? Is the preponderance of evidence of climate change sufficient enough to block different points of view? Because if it's not clear, then we need to balance a story about climate change with sunspots or cyclical changes in climate. But if the evidence is overwhelming, then we need to shut those voices down. And not quite finally, but close to finally, is it actionable? Can you reach a conclusion? Can you, as a result of the information in this story, can you take an action? Can you make a judgment? Should you share this information? And the takeaway, always ask, says who, when evaluating the sources in a news story. Follow the 7-step deconstruction method. Ask, can I make a judgment on the quality of the information? Only act on or share information after you have evaluated its reliability. And of course, this slide was made for an in-class presentation, and you are not bringing it to class, but I want you to be going through it, reading it and answering the questions just for yourself so you can get a sense of how this process works. But especially for the final paper, which I'll be writing to you about very, very shortly, where we're going to actually compare stories about the same subject in a mainstream outlet as opposed to an alternative outlet. So please stay familiar with your deconstruction workbook and watch your email and announcements on Blackboard for the actual assignment. And ladies and gentlemen, I hope you're all staying safe. I hope you are observing the social distancing rules. I have locked myself in a little envelope and sealed it with masking tape and duct tape. I haven't been outside in weeks. I don't mind telling you, I'm going a little bit stir crazy here. But I've spent a lot of time trying to get these PowerPoints into the form that you're watching them now. Just for a little context, it's now 3:30. I've been working on recording this presentation since about noon. I now have to edit it together because I put it together in pieces. And I will probably be finished with that by about 5:30. It will then have to render into a videotape. That will take another hour or two. And tonight, Thursday evening, I will put it up on Facebook, and that all by itself will take about 5 hours. So I've spent a lot of time since the end of the spring break trying to figure out how to do these things, and then they're much more time consuming. I appreciate so much your patience with me during this process, and we're all going to get out of this. We're going to get out of this in good shape. So that's the end of today's class. As I said, watch your email and watch Blackboard announcements for further information. Okay, adios, y'all. Have a good one.